Hey there, welcome back to another video. This time it is a review of the 1985 cult classic, The Stuff. Are you eating it, or is it eating you? Uh, I absolutely adore this movie. This is, I would say, my favorite Larry Cohen film. I just love this film so much. I think it's just a delicious treat. It's one of those movies that gets better every time I watch it. It's infinitely entertaining. I never get tired of it because it's got such a great pace to it. It's wildly unpredictable. It's one of those movies that has many different genres and different sort of twists and turns that easily could seem like something that's just random, but it actually works. And it's just a brilliant satire and send up of consumerism, and one of the best that I've ever seen. It's one of those movies that exemplifies everything that I love about Larry Cohen. He's a director that's not afraid to do high concept ideas. And in this instance, it's about a killer dessert treat. It's about the stuff, which is a substance that was found in the ground by some miners in some small town of nowhere, USA, probably in the Midwest somewhere. And one of them decides to take a taste of it, which in itself is just strange. But when you find out the properties of the stuff, you realize that it probably told him to taste it. So he tastes it, and he's like, "Ooh, this is delicious." And then he gets a friend of his to taste it, and then they say, "Well, maybe we could sell this." And they eventually do get someone to agree to do it. They get approval from the FDA because the FDA is pretty sketchy when it comes to approving products. So they get approval from the FDA. They get a company that's willing to make the stuff, to take the substance out of the ground and package it into these containers. And this actually is a real prop from the movie, by the way. As you can see, it's pretty aged on top. And it actually is signed by Larry Cohen. And this is one of my favorite gifts that I've ever gotten from a good friend of mine named Corey. So once again, thank you, Corey, for this stuff. But anyway, so they put it in this container, and then they market it, and it becomes a massive hit, and just sweeps the nation. America just cannot get enough of this stuff. There's advertisements that even have like Clara Peller from the Where's the Beef campaign. It was very popular in the 80s for Wendy's. You have all these billboards and stuff. You have a stuff uh, franchise that opened up in between a McDonald's and a KFC, and it's eating up the competition, and it's become the number one favorite dessert treat. And it's one of it, but the thing is, it's it's actually pretty sinister. The stuff is made out of some unknown substance that came out of the ground, and it's highly addictive. And yeah, there's no artificial ingredients, and it tastes great, and it's less filling, and it doesn't even spot, and it's one of those things that really makes you feel good, but you pay the price because this substance controls your mind, and then it controls your body. And then ultimately, you are no longer you, and you're just a lifeless husk for the stuff. You become a stuffy, so to speak, which is a stuffed version of a zombie. And it's one of those things that you're like, wow, that's fucking crazy. That's out there. But that's what I love. I love that. I love that Larry Cohen does that. He does films like that, and he was able to make movies like The Stuff because he brought most of the money to the production. A lot of these films were made out of his own pocket, and nowadays you're not going to see big, sort of major films like this. This wasn't necessarily a major film, but I'm just talking about like in terms of movies that actually get a theatrical release, despite the fact that this got a very limited theatrical release. It still got released in theaters, unlike a lot of these other high concept films that just get released direct to video. And it's too bad because I'd love to see more of these high concept films in theaters instead of the play it safe type movies that don't really take that many risks, like Marvel. I hate to say it, but it's true. It really is true about Marvel and Disney. Disney is like the king of play it safe right now, and I don't blame them because it makes them buttloads of money. But it's just not that interesting compared to something like The Stuff, which is just a very unique, fun film. I mean, even the main character is a guy named Mo Rutherford, played by the wonderful character actor Michael Moriarty, and his character is an industrial saboteur. Basically, in other words, what he does is he gets hired by other companies that are getting beat out by some other product, and he gets hired by them to sabotage the competition, and ultimately he ends up becoming the hero, which is a very unlikely hero. And in a lot of ways, I would say this film kind of, I don't say necessarily say it borrows from this particular movie, but I definitely feel it was inspired in some way, and definitely had some elements from it with this particular character. It reminds me so much of Fletch. I can see Mo Rutherford's character being Fletch. I can see Fletch in this movie. I can see Chevy Chase playing Mo or playing Fletch in this movie, and trying to unravel and trying to figure out what this stuff is and so on and so forth, and being the hero. I can totally see it because Mo Rutherford is a similar sort of character who's not your typical lead, and he's got this just great deadpan. And just like Chevy Chase, he was like the king, one of the kings of deadpan. And that's another reason why I love this movie. It's like Fletch, but like a horror movie. It's and I know that's a comparison a lot of people don't make, and I understand because it's not necessarily straight up comedy like Fletch is, but it's just I get so much of that vibe when I watch this movie, especially with the character of Mo, played by Michael Moriarty. Now, the film is just deliciously, just delicately, directed by Larry Cohen. It's one of those. I would say this is. I like films that he did after this, but this is the peak for me. This is the peak of Larry Cohen's career. Is the stuff. There are films he did that he wrote, and films that he directed later on that I like too, like The Ambulance and so on and so forth. But the stuff was the peak, and what a peak it was. Like, really, what a peak it was. Like, he used all of his clout and all of his skills that he learned as a director and really put them to work here. The film only cost $1.7 million to make, and it definitely looks like a film to me that cost $2 to $3 million. Definitely when it comes to some of the more high concept sequences, some of the more visual effects heavy stuff. Does some of the stuff not hold up that well, when it comes to the effects and the stuff? Yeah, but for the time and for the budget, it's still really impressive. So I don't necessarily think the effects are cheesy or they are dated or anything. For the time, they were fairly state of the art, and definitely for the time constraints and for the low budget they had, they were really impressive. You have to look at it in that context. It's not a very big budget movie, so there were a lot of the stuff that they were doing that was pretty difficult, and they managed to really pull it off. And at times, yeah, it looks kind of fake, but it ties into the whole tone of the film, which is surreal anyway. It's a surreal film, so it's all right that some of the effects don't necessarily look as polished. That's just me personally. I still think Steve Neal and company and Jim Danforth, who did the stop motion effects, they all did really admirable jobs. And so did the whole cast and crew for dealing with this just nasty fire retardant foam, which was used a lot for sequences with a lot of the stuff. And when the people get covered in it, it's a really awful experience because it's made mostly out of ground up fish bones. So you can imagine what that would smell like if it's all over you and on a hot summer day in New York. I would think you'd be like gagging. You'd be wanting to throw up. And a lot of a lot of people who were involved with the film when they dealt with it, when they were using that particular type of foam for sequences with the stuff, that it was miserable. There were actors that jumped into the Hudson River right after shooting because it was so miserable. So I got to give them huge kudos and props for dealing with that kind of nastiness. Other times the stuff was shaving cream or whipped cream or some other things like that, or even yogurt, and so it wasn't always just nasty fire retardant. But there were a lot of times though where it was, and it was brutal. Now, yeah, I mean the direction by Larry Cohen. This is a guy, and he even says in the documentary on this Blu-ray that he tries to make his films fun for his actors, despite how a lot of actors say that he's not really the best guy to work with. He still tries to make it engaging for his actors, and that's something that definitely comes across when you watch his films. That maybe they didn't quite get along with Larry while shooting was going on, but the overall experience was worth it because he was doing the best he could to try to get the most out of them, which is and enable them to still have passion for when they get on set. Which, and he mentioned something that a lot of people don't realize about acting, that it's boring. That there are a lot of actors who are just waiting for hours until they go to their next scene. They're just reciting line after line based on memorization. Acting can be really boring, and that's why you get a lot of films where you have actors who phone it in because they're not really feeling it, and they're like, well, I got my paycheck and I don't really want to put that much effort into things. But Larry Cohen really put a lot of emphasis on making the set and making the whole experience of making the movie more collaborative with his actors. And I think that definitely enabled them to have a lot more passion, and as a result, delivered a much better performances. And that definitely is the case with majority of his films when it comes to the actors and their performances. And he does a good job with location shots and does a good job shooting action sequences and sequences with gore and effects. Like, this is a guy who he's just a total professional, total pro. And he does it all. Like, he not only directs, but he writes and he produces and he edits and he does all of these things where he helps edit. It's a type of director you do not see nowadays very much at all anymore. The hands-on guy who has his hands in the mix when it comes to almost everything. And I mean, that's another reason why he's just so sorely missed, is because that's a skill that's slowly dying out. It really, well, not slowly, I would say it's quickly dying out, sadly, as a lot of directors are not that adept at all of these different tasks like someone like Larry Cohen is. He's even rewriting lines and coming up with different scenes while he's shooting the film, something that you really don't see that often with a lot of movies nowadays. So that's something that is just amazing to me, that he's able to do that he's able to just in the moment come up with new lines of dialogue, and he's able to get actors like Michael Moriarty who can actually take those lines and run with them, something that a lot of actors would not be able to do because they would just get frozen and they would get frustrated because you're breaking their concentration. And I get it, but it just makes a lot of his films just so much more unique and interesting because he's able to mold and shape things in a way that's just so much more hands-on than other directors do. The and yeah, going back to the script, I mean, it's just a great script. I mean, you got really fun lines of dialogue. Like there's a moment Michael Moriarty's character Mo steals one of the stuffed trucks and he gets pulled over by a cop, and the cop's like, uh, "Did you know your hose is hanging out?" And then Michael Moriarty, he has a great one-liner where he's like, "What are you gonna do? Arrest me for indecent exposure?" I love that. Like I could totally see, I could totally hear Chevy Chase saying that line too. Uh, but I'm really glad that Moriarty got the role. Like he really channels his inner Chevy Chase here, and not only that, but like a combination of Joe Pantoliano and Steve Buscemi with this character Mo Rutherford. Now, I can't talk about the script without mentioning just the brilliance. Just I love the satire of consumerism in this. It is so scathing and so true and so on point. Uh, you got the over the top ad campaigns that are so true to the 80s and to the time. The commercial has really catchy music and a really great tagline for the entire campaign. Enough is never enough. You know, like that is such a great campaign. And Larry actually hired a guy who actually worked in advertising to put this together and to put everything together for that. He was so ahead of his time too when it comes to advertising this movie. He originally what he wanted to do was have make a series of commercials that were marketing the stuff as if it were a real product and air them on TV, and then for a few weeks up until the release date, and then release a trailer to and that is such a brilliant idea. He is so ahead of his time because nowadays you see that all the time with viral marketing. And he had this idea that was just brilliant back in 1985 that was decades ahead of his time, and didn't get a chance to do it because the studio was like, "Oh, it's too risky. We don't want to do that." I'm like, "Come on, they should have done it. That would have just been amazing." And you would have gotten, I think the film would have done much better in the theater, and I think it would have gotten a much wider release if if the producers, the studios were more willing to take that risk. That would have gotten people buzzing about the stuff. They would have gone to supermarkets and asked about it because, oh, it can help you lose weight and it's less filling and it doesn't have any artificial ingredients. What is this stuff? I want to know what this is. And they'd be really, really curious about it. Some people would be disappointed it's not real, but they would still be really curious about what it's all about. And they'd be really curious about seeing the movie, and that's what marketing is about. That's what the crux of marketing is. I would have even put in ad campaigns in magazines that would market the stuff as if it were a real product. And Larry was ahead of his time too when he was talking about having actual containers of the stuff being sold at concession stands in theaters for a limited time, of that had like a soft serve ice cream or something in there. Just a brilliant idea. And the studio once again put the kibosh on that by saying, "Oh well, it's a liability. If we get sued by someone, then we're in trouble. If they get sick, blah 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 blah." And I'm like, it's still, I mean, it's just such a missed opportunity. I get it. I understand why they didn't do it, but it's such a missed opportunity. Like people could be eating the stuff while they're watching the stuff. Um, but yeah, the the center of this film is definitely the satire of consumerism, and that's one of the main things. That's the main driving force behind this, and it's so good. It is so on point and whip smart and just brilliantly clever. And there's other lines of dialogue too that are just skewering other things, like the military and so on and so forth. Like the Paul Sorvino's character, the kid is telling him, he's like, Americans never lost a war. And then the kid's like, "Oh, what about Nam?" And he's like, "We lost that war at home, son." I mean, that is so fucking true. I mean, oh man. And even at the end of the movie, where these rich fucks, after everything has fallen apart with the stuff and people have figured out what it's doing and they're burning it in the streets, they're like, we're going to come up with a new version called the taste. And it's only got 12% of the organism. It doesn't have the full percent. So it's nowhere near as addictive. And we add actual yogurt and ice cream and stuff. And you know that they would do that shit in a heartbeat. And Larry was interviewed for the documentary on this, and he mentioned a big reason why he did this is because he remembers when, in the 20s, when Coca-Cola actually had real cocaine in it. It was marketed as a health drink. And then he also remembers how in World War II, soldiers were given free Camels. They were given free brands of cigarettes. They were given free cigarettes. And the reason why is so they could get hooked on them early on and often. And he made a really sad and sobering point that more than likely more American soldiers in World War II died of cigarettes than in combat. It just shows you like how much, with marketing and with corporate, with consumerism, that it is one of those things. It's like, are you eating it or is it eating you? I mean, that is such a poignant line of dialogue. It is still every bit as relevant today. I mean, look what's going on with the rise in diabetes and obesity and all of these other things in America. The film's talking about how the stuff is poisoning the American people. Just like all these other products and all these other things that we eat and we put into our bodies are poisoning us and so on and so forth. It is such a relevant film, it's a movie that I think will continue to be timeless for that reason alone, because of the fact that it's something that is still so relevant today, even decades later. And I just one of Cohen's best scripts for me personally. You just have great lines of dialogue, really likable characters, great pace to it, and there's some genuinely horrifying scenes. The stuff with the stuffies where they get punched in the face and there's nothing there except some bits of the stuff that flies out, and the scene where the stuff tries to attack Rutherford and the girl in the hotel room through their pillow and absorbs this one guy. The shot of all the stuffies who were in the factory with their mouths hanging wide open, just laying there dead, lifeless husks while the stuff is flowing around the factory. And even just like the creepy look and demeanor that some of the people had when they're just addicted to this stuff. I mean, for instance, the main kid's parents, something straight out of Invaders from Mars, or Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Just the glazed eyes and just these creepy smiles and everything. And yeah, it was just a very effective film when it comes to the comedy, to the satire. And I mean, you have Garrett Morris from SNL. He's in this as Chocolate Chip Charlie, and his hands are registered as lethal weapons, and just lived with a lot of fun. I would have liked to have seen more of him, to be honest. So I really had a lot of fun with this character. It's kind of too bad what happens to him in the end, but I get why they went that direction. But yeah, just a really great, wonderful screenplay by Larry Cohen, and and equally as great of a cast. This is a perfect cast. We got Michael Moriarty as the lead, as Mo Rutherford. When I get money, I always want Mo. When people give me money, I always want Mo. I love him. He's great. Andrea Marcovicci is Nicole. I also liked her a lot. She had some really good chemistry with Michael Moriarty. She plays the ad campaign gal who sets up the ad campaign that's just massively successful for the stuff, and she ends up becoming one of the characters that puts an end to it, that stops it. I think that's a great idea. That's another thing that you don't see very often, where you have somebody who's responsible for advertising a product and it ends up going bad. They actually are not shying away from things. They're actually taking responsibility for it, and they're actually willing to try to do whatever it takes to stop it. Garrett Morris as Chocolate Chip Charlie, Paul Sorvino in an early role before he really made it big as Colonel Malcolm Gromit Spears, who's this war wacky general who has secluded himself in the woods, has his own private army, and he gets the opportunity to play hero. Very unique type of character. You don't see this kind of character in a lot of films nowadays because, I mean, it's not the character that you usually have who's a good guy. He seems like he's kind of not really a good guy, but he kind of is, which makes it really interesting because he's the type of guy who you should be afraid of and worried about for a good reason. But in this instance, he ends up helping us instead of hindering us or being a part of the problem. I find it crazy that Paul Sorvino, he would go on a few years later to be in The Rocketeer, and he would play like one of the mob guys, and he would be fighting Nazis. And in this, he's kind of fighting communists, and because he calls them commies, which they really are. They're just. But you can look at the stuff and go a little deeper, dig a little deeper into it, and you can see some communist allegories and stuff like that too. So there are a lot of things about this. This is just you can really dig pretty deep into this movie and find all different types of subtext if you choose to do so. But at the same time, it's also a really entertaining, fun movie. So it's one of those films that, yeah, there's subtext and I could see it, but it's also just a riot to watch. Scott Bloom, he plays Jason, who is the lead kid. It was one of the leads in this. I thought he was fantastic for a kid actor, and it's really too bad. It didn't seem like he did that much after this, which really sucks compared to a lot of other kid actors that I've seen. Do go on to have more roles. Maybe it was his own decision. I mean, that happens. There are a lot of actors out there who decide, I'm not really gonna kind of go that far. I'm not gonna do that much extra. But yeah, he didn't really go on to do a whole lot. He was in a few things, but nothing really that big. Danny Aiello was also in this, and in a role before he made it big as Mr. Vickers, who is I believe he's like a character, like he's like he's involved with the people who are like testing the product and so on and so forth for distribution. Patrick O'Neill is in it as Fletcher. You have Ratiana Alda, who plays a psychologist in this. You also have Brooke Adams, Lorraine Landon, Tammy Grimes, Abe Vigoda, and Clara Peller as guest stars in the Stuff commercials. Eric Bogosian from Special Effects. He's in this in an uncredited role as a supermarket clerk who's there to try to stop the kid, Jason, from just destroying all the containers of the stuff in the supermarket. You have Patrick Dempsey as in an uncredited role as like one of the black market stuff buyers at the end of the movie, and you also have Mira Sorvino in another uncredited role because as a factory worker, because she had come to visit her father Paul on set, and she gets a little uncredited role as one of the factory workers. And going back and speaking of the factory, there was a really suspenseful, tense sequence in the factory where Andrea Marcovicci's character Nicole and Scott Bloom's character Jason, they are trying to stay one step ahead of the stuff while it's flowing towards them, and they have to get into these metal bins one by one to get to a door to get away from it. I thought it was a really tense, well put together sequence. Yeah, it's just a really solid, excellent cast. Apparently, speaking of casting, Larry Cohen initially wanted Arsenio Hall as Chocolate Chip Charlie because he thought he was not only a good actor but a rising star. But the executives at New World Pictures, they said no, let's go with Garrett Morris. I think it would have worked with Arsenio Hall too, But it was nice to see Garrett Morris though, because he didn't seem to get a whole lot of roles after SNL. Uh, I always thought he was one of the more underrated performers from the Not Ready for Primetime Players. The film also features some music from Anthony Guffin and Richard Seaman. I would say the jingles by Richard Seaman, who did the commercial jingles for the film, just really catchy. Uh, some of the catchiest jingles that I could think of. Um, such a it is such a perfect encapsulation of 80s advertising. Anthony Gueffin's score, though, it's one of the. I don't really have that many problems with this film at all, but that's one of them. I think at times it doesn't really match the tone of the film that well, and I really do feel that it I mean, the end credits sounds like Superman the movie, and I don't think that really fits with the tone of the movie. And there are moments where it kind of repeats itself. So I would say that's kind of a weak spot. It's not terrible because there are some good bits of the score. I would just say it's not the right stuff for the stuff. The editing by Armand Leibowitz is excellent. I don't really have any problems with the editing. I don't think there's really a problem there. Like I said, it's really well paced. It's 87 minutes. It goes by at a really fast pace. And it's not really an action film, but when there's bits of action, it's effective enough. The horror, it's not the scariest thing out there. If you're going into the stuff expecting a straightforward horror film, you're going to be disappointed. Because that's not really what its goal is. Its goal is to be more of a satire. It's a satire of consumerism, and it's a comedy. And it has horror elements in it that are effective to me. I think they are effective. I think they're genuinely horrifying. I mean, like somebody's jaw dropping wide open and like fucking white goo coming out and going for your face. I think that's pretty scary. A dessert treat that moves around and will take over your mind and your body. I think that's pretty scary. So, but it definitely does lean more towards the comedy aspect and the satire, and that's one of the reasons why I love it so much, though, because it just makes it stand out so much from the rest of the other stuff out there in this particular genre. I really don't know what else to say about this stuff, except the ending. I want to mention the ending real quick, because the ending actually apparently was cut out in the VHS version. And I'm glad it's put back in the theatrical cut, because it kind of sets it up for a sequel bait, and it's kind of defeatist, but it fits the film perfectly, and it's the obvious and the most likely scenario. The stuff would get taken off shelves, and people would actually react to the radio statement by Colonel Spears. And they would burn the stuff, and they would boycott retailers that carried it, and it would go out of favor. But there would be people who would take advantage of the fact that it was really popular and people were really hooked on it, and they would find boxes of it in warehouses and shit, and they would sell it on the black market. And that's how the film ends, and I thought it was perfect, because that's just so true. It is 100% true with these kind of products, especially one that's as addictive as the stuff, which is essentially kind of like a drug, really, very similar to a drug. So I could totally see it being sold in the black market. I'm glad that was put back in the Blu-ray, because it makes a whole lot of sense. It's not something that takes away from my enjoyment of the film that much at all. There's a pretty explosive ending too, where the warehouse, the factory gets blown up, and the franchise gets blown up, and all of that. Apparently those effects were shot by a particular effects company, and Cohen wasn't really pleased with them, and so he only paid them half, and they got pissed, understandably so, and sued him. But they lost because it was just a verbal agreement. There was no contractual agreement involving the effect shots. So, Cohen seems like he's not perfect. He definitely had his fair share of warts, but I'm willing to accept those for the visionary that he was. He was just an absolute visionary. Some people might call him a madman, to each their own, but I feel that he was just a brilliant filmmaker and writer, and just came up with just these just wonderful high concept ideas that only he would have only he would have come up with, or even would have dared to put on the screen. And the stuff is a shining example of that kind of film. So anyway, I don't know what else to say about the stuff. I've talked a lot about it already as it is, except I would recommend this movie if you're a fan of horror, if you're a fan of Larry Cohen, especially. If you're a fan, if this idea sounds interesting to you, you're a fan of satire, of consumerism, especially, definitely give this a watch. It's one of those movies that I feel will just age, like a fine wine, and I think it already has. It's just it still is really delicious, and I just want to eat it up, to the last drop. I just want to keep eating it, and so I really love it so much. But anyway, thank you for watching my review of the stuff. I guess the last thing I'll say is I'll rate it 5 out of 5, 2 thumbs up. It gets my highest recommendation, my highest rating. Anyway, thank you for watching my review of the stuff, and remember, enough is never enough.